In her video, Holly gave an overview of gender-critical and trans activist beliefs. An interesting feature of the gender-critical versus trans activist battle is that both sides represent themselves as feminist, what we would call gender-critical feminist, and they would call trans-exclusionary or TERF feminism, and what both sides don't seem to mind calling trans-inclusionary feminism. What I'm going to do in this video is argue that gender-critical feminism is feminism and trans-inclusionism is not. To be clear, my point is not that trans-inclusionism is not a worthy politics, only that it is not and should not be mistaken for a feminist politics. The gender-critical versus trans activist battle should be seen for what it is, a battle between two conflicting politics, one for women's liberation and the other for the social inclusion of the gender non-conforming. The animating impulse of feminism is the belief that women, qua women, are an oppressed class. To understand how women are oppressed, feminists first looked to an existing theoretical framework, Marxism. They attempted to locate women's oppression within this framework by theorizing women as an economic class exploited under capitalism. Call those feminists the Marxist feminists. That attempt failed. Feminists then attempted to extend the Marxist framework, positing the existence of a second system, patriarchy. Call those feminists the socialist feminists. That attempt also failed, since in the Marxist framework, the economy is the primary system, such that patriarchy can be nothing more than a product of the economy, a secondary system that the struggle against capitalism will eradicate. Finally, feminists set about developing an altogether new framework. In this framework, patriarchy is a system in which maleness determines membership of the oppressor class and femaleness determines membership of the oppressed class. Men and women thus became the names of political classes as opposed to merely biological ones. As Monique Wittig wrote, it is our historical task, and only ours, to make it evident that women are a class, which is to say that the category woman as well as the category man are political categories, not eternal ones. Our fight aims to suppress men as a class, not through a genocidal but a political struggle. Once the class men disappears, women as a class will disappear as well, for there are no slaves without masters. Call the feminists who developed this new framework the radical feminists. Radical feminism is one form of feminism, but it is also feminism proper in that it is to date the only form of feminism that has succeeded in theorizing women, qua women, as an oppressed class. It's from the radical feminist claim that sex determines membership of class that you get the third gender-critical belief on Holly's list, sex matters politically, and you get Thomas's claim that for political reasons, for reasons of picking out an oppressed group, we need terms that refer to sex. Mere decades later, this hard-won framework has all but disappeared. Where radical feminists theorize patriarchy as a system of sex class, contemporary trans-inclusionary feminists conceive of it as the system of the gender binary. According to this view, the binary requires people to be male or female, man or woman, and all those who are not clearly inside the binary are outside the system and thus unintelligible and excluded. Author of the Transfeminist Manifesto, Koyama, writes of the patriarchal binary gender system. Philosopher Robin Dembroff says that patriarchy's theoretical foundation combines three beliefs. Stating these beliefs doesn't require the terms men and women at all. Male and female are a natural, immutable, and exhaustive binary. All males should be masculine and all females should be feminine. Masculinity is incompatible with and superior to femininity. Historian Yves Rees says that if patriarchy is built upon this hierarchical binary, it follows that the feminist project of dismantling patriarchy requires the disavowal of binary gender. Notice that on a conceptualization of patriarchy as a system of sex class, trans women are members of the male sex class, the oppressor group, while on a conceptualization of patriarchy as a system of the gender binary, trans women who do not conform to the binary are far from the oppressor, victims. This shift in understanding of patriarchy is thus significant. Judith Butler's book, Gender Trouble, was influential in developing the understanding of patriarchy as the gender binary system. Butler argues that the gender binary designates certain ways of being as normal. Those ways of being are being male, heterosexual, male identifying, and masculine presenting, and being female, heterosexual, female identifying, and feminine presenting. In the name of normalcy, we are molded into and we mold ourselves into these ways of being. Were it not for this binary, we would not have the two distinct groups of people that we appear to have. As the gender binary designates certain ways of being as normal, it designates others, ways of being that deviate from it, as unintelligible, to use Butler's word. The people designated as unintelligible include intersex people, transsexual people, lesbian and gay people, bisexual people, non-binary people, and transgendered people. In Butler's work, a synonym for unintelligible is excluded. She writes, in her characteristically clear and unpretentious way, that the constraints of certain highly gendered regulatory schemas not only produce the domain of intelligible bodies, but produce as well a domain of unthinkable, abject, unlivable bodies. The latter is the excluded and illegible domain that haunts the former domain as the spectre of its own impossibility, the very limit to intelligibility, its constitutive outside. I think trans activists' talk of exclusion and inclusion comes from Butler. On this view, it's not men who have power over women, it's the gender binary that has power, producing some of us as either male, heterosexual, male-identifying and masculine presenting, or female, heterosexual, female-identifying and feminine presenting, and in doing so, rendering others of us unintelligible. With this framework, we get a new understanding of patriarchy. Patriarchy becomes the system of the gender binary. And once patriarchy becomes the system of the gender binary, it becomes plausible to add, as Dembroff does, the gender non-conforming alongside women to the list of patriarchy's victims. Dembroff writes, violence against non-binary persons and trans men, discrimination against gay and gender non-conforming non-trans men, and cosmetic genital surgeries on infants who are intersex are neither separate nor separable from the violence, discrimination, and body policing that non-trans women constantly experience. We have an explanatorily powerful, unifying story to tell about what holds these forms of marginalization and mistreatment together. They are all manifestations of misogyny, the force that, in man's terms, patrols and polices the patriarchal order. Man here refers to feminist philosopher Kate Manne, whose book Down Girl offers a novel understanding of misogyny. In other words, it becomes plausible to say that the gender non-conforming and women are allies engaged in struggle against a common enemy, patriarchy. It then seems irrational for gender-critical feminists to be treating trans women like the enemy. But notice how very different Butler's framework is from the radical feminist one. In the radical feminist framework, oppression is the injustice, men qua men are the perpetrators of injustice, women qua women are the victims of injustice, and the liberation of women from men is justice. In Butler's framework, unintelligibility exclusion is the injustice, the gender binary is the source of injustice, the gender non-conforming are the victims of injustice, and the intelligibility or inclusion of those who deviate from the gender binary is justice. Each framework calls for a very different politics. The radical feminist framework calls for a struggle by women against men for their liberation. Butler's framework calls for a subversion of the gender binary in order that the unintelligible and excluded can become intelligible and included. And these frameworks and politics are not different in the sense of being two different forms of feminism. Earlier, I said that the animating impulse of feminism is the belief that women qua women are an oppressed class. This belief has inspired and unified the various forms of feminism: Marxist feminism, socialist feminism, radical feminism, liberal feminism, difference feminism. In Butler's framework, women qua women do not suffer injustice. People are distinguished by their conformity to or deviation from the gender binary. The distinctive groupings are gender conforming and gender non-conforming. Men as such and women as such are not groups, much less oppressor and oppressed. Men and women show up only qua members of the gender conforming or non-conforming group, only qua cis or trans. Qua cis, they are privileged. Qua trans, they are excluded. With Butler's framework, the terms men and women become, as Dembroff says, unnecessary. In Butler's framework, women only qua gender non-conforming suffer injustice. Women qua women, women irrespective of their conformity to or deviation from the gender binary, do not. Butler's framework is not feminist, but Butler explicitly presents her framework as feminist. Indeed, the subtitle of Gender Trouble is Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. And for whatever reason, many feminists embraced it as feminist. As feminists embraced Butler's framework, a series of usurpations occurred. Butler's analysis of injustice usurped the radical feminist analysis as the feminist analysis of injustice. The system of the gender binary usurped the system of sex class as the system of injustice with which feminism is concerned. The struggle for the inclusion of the gender nonconforming usurped the struggle for the liberation of women as the feminist struggle. And the constituency of the gender nonconforming usurped the constituency of women as the feminist constituency. In sum, Butler's feminism, the feminism that understands patriarchy as the system of the gender binary, is not feminism at all. When feminists embraced it as a superior form of feminism, feminism was not progressed, it was displaced. Trans-inclusionary feminists deny that trans-inclusionary politics conflict with feminist politics. Dembroff, for example, writes of the dangerous illusion perpetuated by groups like gender-critical feminists that these groups have conflicting political interests. On the contrary, they claim the gender nonconforming and women are allies engaged in struggle against a common enemy, patriarchy. A nice statement of this view can be found in Koyama, who writes, various forms of feminisms, queer activism, transfeminism, and other progressive movements all attack different portions of the common target, which is the heterosexist patriarchy. But the patriarchy that is the target of trans-inclusionism is a completely different thing from the patriarchy that is the target of feminism. Feminists and trans-inclusionists are not fighting one war against patriarchy, they are fighting different wars, the former against the sex class men and the latter against the gender binary. With trans women's demand for recognition as women, these wars collide. In the gender binary analysis, justice consists in intelligibility or inclusion, and intelligibility or inclusion for trans women consists in the affirmation of their self-identification as women. Those fighting against the gender binary must therefore insist on the acceptance of trans women's demand for recognition as women. Whereas, in the feminist analysis, trans women are, qua male people, members of the sex class men. To recognize them as women would be to recognize members of the oppressor group as members of the oppressed group. And if one cannot identify one's oppressor, then one cannot defeat it. Feminists must therefore reject trans women's demand for recognition as women. So feminists now must choose for what and for whom they will fight. For women's liberation or trans women's inclusion. For women or trans women. Gender-critical feminists have made their choice, women's liberation. Although trans-inclusionary feminists deny that they must make a choice, they too have made theirs, trans women's inclusion. I have made this video in the hope that women who choose trans women's inclusion will at least confront their choice and stop pretending to themselves and to others that they're feminists fighting for women and women's liberation. For women, that pretense adds insult to injury.